The spring evening air felt perfect as David Thompson stepped out of Marcello's restaurant, loosening his tie just a bit. The Italian food had been excellent, and the business dinner went even better than expected. At 42, he'd learned to appreciate these small victories in life. He pulled out his phone and dialed his wife. "Hey honey, I'm done. Yeah, the meeting went great. I'm waiting out front whenever you're ready." He smiled at something she said, then added, "No rush. Take your time." David stood near the restaurant's entrance, his navy suit catching the glow of the streetlights. A few other people lingered nearby, some smoking, others on their phones. It was a typical Thursday night in the downtown district. Nothing unusual, nothing worth noticing, except someone did notice. A police cruiser rolled up slowly to the curb, and two officers got out. David barely glanced at them at first. Police presence downtown wasn't uncommon, but then he noticed they were walking directly toward him. "Evening, sir," the taller officer said. His nameplate read, "Daniels. We're going to need you to move along." David looked up from his phone, confused. "I'm sorry, what? You heard me?" "Keep it moving," Daniels repeated, his tone sharper now. David glanced around. A woman in a red dress stood just 10 feet away, also on her phone. A couple sat on the bench nearby, waiting. Nobody was asking them to move. He felt that familiar tightness in his chest, that feeling he'd hoped he wouldn't have to experience again. "Officer, I just had dinner here," David said calmly, keeping his voice even. "I'm waiting for my wife to pick me up. Is there a problem?" The second officer, Rodriguez, stepped closer. "We got a call about someone loitering. That's you." "Loitering?" David almost laughed, but he knew better. He'd been through versions of this before. "I've been standing here for maybe 3 minutes. I have my receipt right here if you need to see it." He slowly reached for his wallet, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible. The last thing he needed was a misunderstanding. But as he pulled out the receipt, Daniels held up his hand. "We don't need to see that. We need you to move along now." David felt the heat rising in his face, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Sir, with all respect, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm a paying customer waiting for my ride. Those people over there are doing the same thing." "Are you refusing to comply?" Rodriguez asked, his hand moving to his belt. "I'm not refusing anything," David said, his voice still steady despite his racing heart. "I'm asking why I'm being treated differently than everyone else here." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. "Turn around," Daniels commanded. "Put your hands behind your back." David's world seemed to slow down. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not again. "Officer, please. I haven't done anything. My wife is literally 2 minutes away. You're being disorderly. Turn around now or we'll turn you around." David looked around desperately. The woman in the red dress was staring. The couple on the bench had their phones out. He could see the red dots of recording starting. Part of him was grateful for the witnesses. Another part of him was humiliated that this moment would be captured forever. He knew he had two choices: resist and make things infinitely worse, or comply and hope to sort this out later. His hands shook as he slowly turned around and placed them behind his back. The metal handcuffs bit into his wrists, too tight. He winced but said nothing. "You have the right to remain silent," Daniels began, and David's mind went somewhere else. He thought about his 2 sons at home, probably doing homework. He thought about the conversation he'd had with them just last month about staying calm if police ever stopped them. He thought about how he'd told them that if they were respectful and compliant, everything would be okay. He'd lied to his boys. He knew that now. "David!" The scream cut through everything. His wife Lisa had just pulled up. She threw the car into park and jumped out, not even closing the door. "What are you doing? That's my husband, David." "Ma'am, step back," Rodriguez warned, moving toward her. "Step back? You're arresting my husband for standing on a sidewalk." Lisa's voice cracked with anger and fear. "He was waiting for me." "What is wrong with you?" "Ma'am, if you don't step back, we'll arrest you too for interfering with police business." David found his voice. "Lisa, it's okay, just call Robert." Robert was their attorney, a family friend. Call him right now. You're not allowed to tell her what to do, Daniel said, pushing David toward the patrol car. That's my wife, David said, his calm finally cracking. I have the right to speak to my wife. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it. The crowd had grown now. Phones were everywhere, all recording. David could hear people yelling. He didn't do anything. This is wrong. Let him go. But the officers didn't let him go. They put their hand on his head and pushed him into the back of the cruiser. The door slammed shut, and suddenly David was surrounded by metal and plexiglass. He could see Lisa outside, crying and yelling into her phone. He could see the crowd of strangers, their faces shocked and angry. Through it all, he kept thinking one thing over and over. They never even asked his name. They never asked for identification. They never asked him anything except to move. The car pulled away from the curb, and David watched through the window as Lisa ran after them for a few steps before stopping. Even from a distance, he could see she was sobbing. Inside the patrol car, David sat in silence. His mind was racing, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Stay calm. Don't give them a reason. Don't make it worse. You know, if you just walked away when we asked, none of this would have happened, Rodriguez said from the front seat. David stared at the metal grating separating them. He wanted to say so much. He wanted to scream that he had every right to stand on that sidewalk. He wanted to ask why the woman in the red dress wasn't in handcuffs. He wanted to know what the actual crime was, but he said nothing, because he knew that anything he said would be used against him. The precinct came into view, all harsh lights and concrete. David had seen the inside of police stations before, but always from the other side of things. Always as someone who belonged there. This time would be different. As they pulled into the parking lot, David caught his reflection in the window. He looked tired, defeated, angry, but mostly he just looked sad. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about his sons who would hear about this. This was about every other man who'd been in this situation without the resources to fight back. This was about a system that saw his expensive suit and his polite words and still only saw one thing. The car door opened. "Let's go," Daniel said, pulling David out by his arm. As they walked him into the station, David made himself a promise. However this ended, whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. They had no idea who they'd just arrested, and very soon, they were going to find out. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making David's headache worse. He'd been sitting on the cold metal bench in the holding cell for what felt like hours. No watch, no phone, no way to tell time. Just him and 3 other men who looked just as tired and frustrated as he felt. The processing had been mechanical. Empty your pockets, sign here, stand there, fingerprints, photos. They treated him like every other person who came through those doors. Like he was nobody. Like his life, his career, his dignity meant absolutely nothing. "Thompson," a voice called out. "You get your phone call now." Finally. David stood up, his back aching from the uncomfortable bench. They led him to a phone mounted on the wall, the old-fashioned kind with a metal cord. He dialed Lisa's number. She picked up before the first ring finished. "David, oh thank God, are you okay?" "I'm fine, honey, did you call Robert?" "He's already working on it, he's making calls right now." "Baby, this is insane, I recorded everything. So did about 15 other people. It's already online." David closed his eyes. Of course it was online. In today's world, everything ended up online. "How are the boys?" Confused, scared. Michael wanted to come down to the station. I told him absolutely not. Their oldest, 16, and already so angry at the world. David could only imagine how this would fuel that fire. "Tell them I'm okay. Tell them I'll be home soon." He hoped he wasn't lying. Robert says not to say anything to anyone. Not a word. "I know the drill," David said quietly. "I love you. I'll see you soon." He hung up and let the officer lead him back to the cell. As he walked, he noticed his personal belongings sitting in a clear plastic bag on the desk. His wallet, his keys, his phone, and something else. Something that should have changed everything the moment they saw it. But the desk sergeant had barely looked. Just tossed everything in the bag and moved on to the next person. Another number, another arrest, another day. David sat back down on the bench and leaned his head against the cold concrete wall. He thought about that badge sitting in that bag. The badge he'd carried for 20 years. The badge that represented every sacrifice he'd made, every late night, every difficult decision. They never even looked at it. Hours passed. Men came and went from the cell. Some were released. Some were moved. David stayed, waiting, thinking, planning. Around 11 o'clock, things changed. He heard raised voices from down the hall. A woman's voice, sharp and commanding, then footsteps quick and purposeful. The door to the cell area opened, and a female lieutenant stormed in. She went straight to the desk sergeant. "Where's the property for David Thompson?" The desk sergeant looked confused. "Thompson? Let me check." He shuffled through bags until he found the right one. He held it up. The lieutenant grabbed it and dumped the contents on the desk. She picked up the badge, and even from the cell, David could see her face change. She went completely pale. "Oh no," she whispered. Then louder, "Oh no. No, no, no." She spun around to face the desk sergeant. "Do you know who this man is?" "Some guy arrested for disorderly conduct." "What's the big deal?" The lieutenant held up the badge so close to his face he had to lean back. "This is Deputy Chief David Thompson, State Police, Internal Affairs Division." The color drained from the desk sergeant's face. "Where are Daniels and Rodriguez?" the lieutenant demanded. "I think they're still on patrol. We'll get them back here now. And somebody get Deputy Chief Thompson out of that cell immediately." The next few minutes were chaos. The cell door opened and suddenly everyone was apologizing. "Sir this, sir that." David stood slowly, saying nothing. He watched them scramble, watched them panic, and felt absolutely nothing. The lieutenant approached him. "Deputy Chief Thompson, I'm Lieutenant Karen Hayes. I'm so deeply sorry about this situation. If you'll come with me, the chief is on his way." David followed her without a word. They took him to an office, offered him coffee, water, anything he needed. He asked for water and sat down, still silent. His mind was working through everything, analyzing it the way he'd analyzed hundreds of other cases. The difference was, this time, he was the case. 20 minutes later, Daniels and Rodriguez arrived. David could hear them in the hallway, laughing about something. Then Lieutenant Hayes's voice cut through their laughter like a knife. "In my office. Both of you. Now." Their faces, when they walked in and saw David sitting there out of the cell, drinking water calmly. It would have been funny if the whole situation wasn't so infuriating. "Do either of you want to explain yourselves?" Hayes asked, her voice ice cold. Daniel spoke first. "Explain what?" "We arrested a guy for disorderly conduct. He was loitering, refused to comply." "Refused to comply?" David finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying weight. "I asked you why I was being singled out. That's not refusing to comply. That's asking a reasonable question." Rodriguez jumped in. "You were getting aggressive." "I was calm the entire time," David interrupted. "And there are about 15 videos that prove it. Videos that are currently circulating online, showing 2 officers arresting a man for standing outside a restaurant waiting for his wife." The 2 officers shifted uncomfortably. Hayes held up David's badge. "Did either of you check his identification before you arrested him?" Silence. "Did you ask his name? His occupation? Did you do any actual police work? Or did you just see a black man in a nice suit and make assumptions?" "We didn't," Daniel started. "You didn't what?" David stood up now, and both officers took a step back. "You didn't see my color, please. Don't insult both of us by pretending this was anything other than what it was." The door opened, and Police Chief William Bradford walked in. He was a large man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes. When he saw David, those eyes got even more tired. "David," he said quietly. "Bill." They'd known each other for 15 years. Not friends exactly, but colleagues. They'd worked together on several task forces. They'd shared meals at conferences. They'd respected each other's work. And now this. "Get them out of here," Bradford said to Hayes, gesturing at Daniels and Rodriguez. "Put them on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I want their body cam footage on my desk within the hour." The 2 officers looked like they wanted to say something, but Hayes was already ushering them out. The door closed, leaving just David and Bradford. I don't even know where to start, Bradford said, sitting down heavily. Then don't, David replied. Just get me my things so I can go home to my family. David, I need you to know. Bill, I've been in that cell for 4 hours. 4 hours for standing on a sidewalk. I've been fingerprinted, photographed, and treated like a criminal. And the only reason I'm standing in this office right now instead of spending the night in that cell is because of this. He picked up his badge. Not because I'm innocent. Not because your officers made a mistake. But because of who I am. Bradford had no response to that. Now imagine, David continued, everyone who goes through what I went through, but without this badge. Without your number in their phone. Without a lawyer on speed dial. What happens to them, Bill? The question hung in the air. David's phone was returned to him along with his other belongings. He had 47 missed calls and over 100 text messages. The video had gone viral. Of course it had. Lisa was waiting in the lobby, and when she saw him, she ran into his arms. She was shaking, and he realized he was too. Let's go home, he whispered. As they walked out of the station, David looked back once. Through the glass doors, he could see Bradford standing there watching them leave. The chief looked older somehow, more defeated. Good, David thought. Let him feel a fraction of what we feel every single day. The night air hit his face, and David took a deep breath. His suit was wrinkled. His wrists still hurt from the handcuffs. His pride was bruised, his dignity was damaged, and his faith in the system he'd served for 2 decades was shattered. But he was free. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. David didn't sleep that night. He sat in his home office, still in his wrinkled suit, watching his arrest play out on screen after screen. The video had been shared thousands of times. News outlets were picking it up. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Lisa brought him coffee around 3 a.m. She didn't say anything, just kissed the top of his head and sat down next to him. They watched together in silence as strangers on the internet debated whether he'd been treated fairly or not. As if it was even a debate. The boys saw it, Lisa said quietly. Michael punched a hole in his bedroom wall. David closed his eyes. Is he okay? No, none of us are okay. She took his hand. What are you going to do? He looked at her. This woman who'd stood by him through everything. 20 years of marriage. 20 years of watching him come home exhausted from investigating corrupt cops and broken systems. She'd never asked him to quit, even when it got dangerous. Even when other officers treated him like a traitor for holding his own accountable. I'm going to make sure this matters, he said. Not just for me. For everyone. The next morning, David put on a fresh suit and drove to the state police headquarters. He'd been given the week off, but he wasn't taking it. He had work to do. His office felt different somehow. Same desk, same files, same photos of his family on the shelf. But he felt different walking into it. Like he'd crossed some invisible line and couldn't go back. His assistant, Gloria, hugged him the moment she saw him. I saw the video. I've been so angry I couldn't sleep. Join the club, David said with a tired smile. Gloria, I need you to pull something for me. Every arrest made by officers Daniels and Rodriguez for the past 2 years. Every single one, her eyebrows went up. That's a lot of files. I know. And I want their body cam footage for each arrest, too. Gloria nodded and got to work. Within an hour, David's office was filled with case files. He started reading, and what he found made his stomach turn. Daniels and Rodriguez had arrested 63 people for disorderly conduct in the past 2 years. 41 of them were black. 15 were Hispanic. 7 were white. The pattern was impossible to ignore. David dug deeper. He watched body cam footage until his eyes burned. Arrest after arrest, he saw the same thing. Escalation, aggression, assumptions. People who were doing nothing wrong, treated like criminals. People who asked questions, told they were being disorderly. A young man arrested for suspicious behavior while waiting for the bus. A woman arrested for creating a disturbance when she asked why she was being questioned. A father arrested in front of his kids for refusing to comply when he asked to see a warrant. The worst part? Most of these people pleaded guilty, not because they were guilty, but because fighting the charge cost money they didn't have, time they couldn't afford to lose, jobs they couldn't risk losing. So they paid the fine, took the mark on their record, and moved on with their lives. But David couldn't move on. Not anymore. He called Chief Bradford. We need to meet, now. They met at a coffee shop off the highway away from both their offices. Bradford looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. He ordered black coffee and sat down across from David without making eye contact. "I've been reviewing Daniels and Rodriguez's arrest records," David said, sliding a folder across the table. "Take a look." Bradford opened it and started reading. David watched his face change as the numbers sank in. "The patterns. The problems. This is bad," Bradford said quietly. "It's worse than bad, Bill. It's systematic. These two officers have been profiling people for years, and nobody noticed, or nobody cared to notice when that's not fair, isn't it?" David leaned forward. "I run internal affairs for the state. I investigate officers for a living. And this happened to me. If I can be arrested for standing on a sidewalk, what chance does anyone else have?" Bradford rubbed his face. "What do you want me to do?" "I want a full investigation. I want every one of these arrests reviewed. I want these officers fired, not just suspended. And I want them flagged so they can't just move to another department and do this all over again. You know the union will fight this." "Let them fight," David said. "I've got video evidence, body cam footage, and a pattern of behavior that any lawyer would love to get their hands on. The union can't protect bad cops forever." Bradford was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know this is going to get ugly. For both of us." "It's already ugly, Bill. At least now we're doing something about it." The investigation was announced that afternoon. The media went crazy. David's phone rang nonstop with interview requests. He ignored most of them, but he did agree to one press conference. If he was going to tell this story, he was going to tell it his way. Lisa helped him pick out his uniform, full dress medals and all. He wanted people to see exactly who he was. Not just a victim, a deputy chief, someone who dedicated his life to the law. The press conference room was packed, cameras everywhere, reporters shouting questions before he even reached the podium. Lisa stood off to the side, giving him a small nod of encouragement. David adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd. For a moment, he was back in that patrol car, watching Lisa cry on the sidewalk. Then he took a breath and began. "My name is Deputy Chief David Thompson. 2 nights ago, I was arrested while waiting for my wife outside a restaurant. I was handcuffed, processed, and held in a cell for 4 hours. My crime? Standing on a public sidewalk." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here because what happened to me happens every single day to people who don't have my badge or my resources. People who can't fight back. People who take plea deals because they can't afford lawyers. People who lose jobs, lose opportunities, lose their dignity because someone made assumptions based on the color of their skin." A reporter shouted a question, but David held up his hand. "I'm not done. I've spent 20 years in law enforcement. I became a cop because I believed in justice. I believed that if you did the right thing, followed the rules, respected authority, you'd be treated fairly. I taught that to my sons. I told them that if they were ever stopped by police to be polite, be compliant, and everything would be okay." His voice cracked slightly. "I lied to them, because I've done everything right and I still ended up in handcuffs." The room was completely silent now. "So here's what's going to happen. We're conducting a full review of every arrest made by the officers involved in my case. We're looking at patterns, at practices, at policies, and we're going to find out if this was an isolated incident or part of a bigger problem. Spoiler alert, it's a bigger problem." He looked directly into the cameras. "To everyone watching who's been through something similar, I see you. I believe you, and I'm going to use every bit of power I have to make sure this system works for everyone, not just people who look a certain way or have certain connections." He took off his badge and held it up. "This badge saved me. It got me out of that cell. It got me this press conference. But it shouldn't take a badge for someone to be treated with basic human dignity. That needs to change. And I'm going to spend every day I have left in this career making sure it does." The questions came flooding in after that, but David had said what he needed to say. He stepped away from the podium, took Lisa's hand, and walked out. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. He checked it later in the car. "Thank you for speaking up. My son was arrested by those same officers last year. Nobody believed him. Now maybe they will." David showed the text to Lisa. She squeezed his hand. "You did good," she said. "I did what I had to do," he replied. "But this is just the beginning." The text messages started coming in within hours of the press conference. Dozens at first, then hundreds. People David had never met sharing their stories. Stories that sounded exactly like his. A college student arrested for loitering outside his own apartment building. A nurse arrested for disorderly conduct after asking why she was being pulled over. A grandfather arrested in front of his grandchildren for resisting when he asked to call his daughter. All arrested by Daniels and Rodriguez. All with the same pattern. David sat at his kitchen table reading message after message. Lisa looked over his shoulder, her hand covering her mouth. "There are so many," she whispered. "I know," David said, "and these are just the ones brave enough to come forward." His son Michael walked in, backpack slung over his shoulder. He'd barely spoken since the arrest. Now he stood in the doorway, looking at his father like he was seeing him for the first time. "Everyone at school's talking about it," Michael said. "About what happened to you, yeah?" David set down his phone. "What are they saying?" Michael shrugged, but David could see the emotion behind it. "Some kids say you deserved it, that you must have done something wrong. But others," he paused, "others are sharing their own stories. About their dads, their uncles, their brothers. It's like everyone has a story like this." David felt his chest tighten. His younger son, Anthony, appeared behind Michael. Only 13, but old enough to understand what was happening. "Dad, Coach Brian said his brother got arrested by the same cops," Anthony said quietly. He said nobody believed him when he complained. But now they might. This was what David hadn't expected. Not the media attention or the investigation. But this, the flood of people finally feeling like someone would listen. Finally having proof they weren't crazy, weren't making it up, weren't exaggerating. The weight of it was crushing. The next few weeks were brutal. The police union came after David hard. They accused him of having a vendetta, of using his position unfairly, of trying to destroy 2 officers' careers over a simple misunderstanding. The union president went on TV. "Deputy Chief Thompson is a respected officer, but he's letting his emotions cloud his judgment. These officers made a tough call in a difficult situation. That's what cops do every day." David watched the interview from his office, his jaw clenched. Gloria stood in the doorway, equally furious. "They're really going to defend this?" she asked. "They always do," David replied. "That's the problem." But then something unexpected happened. Other officers started coming forward. Not publicly at first, but in quiet conversations, in parking lots after shifts, in text messages marked confidential. A veteran officer pulled David aside at headquarters. "I've worked with Rodriguez. I've seen how he operates. A lot of us have. But nobody wanted to be the one to say something." "Why not?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. The officer looked uncomfortable. "Because you become a target. You become the rat, the snitch. Nobody wants to work with you anymore. So you just let it continue?" "I'm not proud of it," the officer said. "But I've got a family to feed. A career to protect," he paused. "But what happened to you? That changed things. If it can happen to a deputy chief, it can happen to anyone. Some of us are ready to talk now, if you'll listen." David listened, and what he heard painted a picture he'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Daniels and Rodriguez weren't anomalies. They were symptoms. Products of a culture that protected its own, even when its own were wrong. The investigation expanded. David brought in officers from other districts to review the cases, people with no ties to the local department. They found more problems, more patterns, more victims. A breakthrough came when they discovered that several cases had been dismissed by judges who saw right through the charges. But those dismissals were buried in paperwork, never flagged, never reviewed. The officers just moved on to the next arrest. David compiled everything into a report. 63 arrests, 41 questionable stops, 27 cases dismissed by judges, dozens of complaints filed and ignored. 2 officers with a clear pattern of targeting people of color. He delivered the report to Chief Bradford personally. They met in Bradford's office late one evening when most people had gone home. Bradford read through it slowly, his expression getting darker with each page. When he finished, he set it down and looked at David. "This is going to end careers," Bradford said. "Not just theirs." "I know," David replied. "Maybe it should, mine included." David met his eyes. "That depends on what you do next." Bradford was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. "Get the union president on the line. And the mayor. We need to talk." The meeting happened 2 days later. David wasn't invited, but he heard about it from people who were there. Bradford had laid out everything. The numbers, the patterns, the body cam footage. He'd given the union a choice. Work with them to clean up the department or fight them and have everything go public in ways they couldn't control. The union chose to fight. So David made good on his promise. He released the full report to the media. Every number, every pattern, every dismissed case. He included statements from victims who were willing to go public. He included analysis from civil rights attorneys who reviewed the body cam footage. The story exploded. National news picked it up. Civil rights organizations demanded federal investigations. The mayor held an emergency press conference promising reforms. But David wasn't done. He reached out to every person who'd been arrested by Daniels and Rodriguez. His team helped them file formal complaints. They connected them with pro bono attorneys. They helped them get their records expunged. One evening, David met with a young man named Terrence. He'd been arrested 2 years ago for suspicious behavior while walking home from work. He'd pleaded guilty because he couldn't afford a lawyer. That misdemeanor had cost him 3 job opportunities since then. "Why are you doing this?" Terrence asked. "You got arrested, yeah, but you're out. You're fine. Why keep pushing?" David thought about his sons, about Michael's anger and Anthony's fear, about every parent who had to have the talk with their kids about how to survive a police encounter. "Because I have a badge that got me out," David said. "You didn't have that. Most people don't. That's not justice. That's just luck. And justice shouldn't be about luck." Terrence's eyes filled with tears. "Nobody's ever believed me before. Everyone said I must have done something. That cops don't just arrest people for nothing. They believed you because they needed to," David said. "Because believing you meant questioning the system. And that's scary for people. It's easier to blame you than to admit the system failed. But you're part of the system." "I am," David acknowledged, "which is why I have to fix it, or at least try." A week later, the state police board held a hearing. Daniels and Rodriguez were officially terminated. Not suspended, not reassigned. Fired. And flagged in a new statewide database that would prevent them from being hired by any other law enforcement agency in the state. The union filed appeals. They'd fight it for months, maybe years. But the precedent was set. David stood outside the hearing room afterward, watching the 2 former officers leave. Rodriguez wouldn't look at him. But Daniel stopped, turned and stared. "You destroyed our lives," Daniel said, his voice shaking with anger. David stepped closer. "No. I held you accountable. There's a difference. You destroyed your own lives. The moment you decided that badge gave you the right to treat people like they were less than human. We were just doing our jobs." "No," David interrupted. "You were abusing your power, and you did it for so long that you actually believed you were right. That's the scariest part." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but David was already walking away. He'd said what he needed to say. The rest was up to the courts. Lisa was waiting in the parking lot. She hugged him tight. "It's not over," David said into her shoulder. "This is just 2 officers. The problem is so much bigger." "I know," Lisa said, "but you did something. You proved it could be done. That has to count for something." David pulled back and looked at her. "I want to do more, not just investigations, real change, policy change, training change, cultural change." Lisa smiled, even though he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Then let's change it." 6 months after that night outside the restaurant, David stood in front of the state legislature. The room was packed with lawmakers, police chiefs, community activists, and reporters. Everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind. The investigation into Daniels and Rodriguez had sparked investigations in 3 other departments. Patterns of discriminatory policing were found in places people hadn't even thought to look. The dominoes kept falling. But David hadn't just been investigating. He'd been building something new. "Thank you for having me here today," David began, looking out at the sea of faces. 6 months ago, I was arrested for standing on a sidewalk. That arrest lasted 4 hours, but its impact will last the rest of my life. Not because of what happened to me, but because of what I learned about what happens to everyone else. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation. Numbers filled the screen. In our state alone, over 12,000 people are arrested each year for disorderly conduct or similar minor charges. 68% of those arrests involve people of color, despite our population being only 32% people of color. These aren't just statistics. These are parents, workers, students, people whose lives are permanently changed by arrests that should never have happened. A hand went up in the audience. Senator Patricia Walsh, someone David had met with several times over the past months. Deputy Chief Thompson, what's your proposed solution? This was the moment he'd been preparing for. I'm proposing the Police Accountability and Reform Act, David said. It's comprehensive legislation that addresses the root causes of discriminatory policing. First, mandatory de-escalation training for all officers, updated annually. Second, body cameras must be active during all public interactions, with footage reviewed regularly by civilian oversight committees. Third, a statewide database that tracks officer complaints and patterns, preventing problem officers from just moving to new departments. He clicked to the next slide. Fourth, and this is critical, we establish real consequences. Officers with patterns of discriminatory behavior face mandatory retraining. Repeat offenders lose their badges permanently. And fifth, we create a civilian review board with actual power to investigate and recommend disciplinary action. The room erupted in discussion, some people nodding, others shaking their heads. David had expected this. Change was never easy, especially change that challenged power structures. Over the next 3 months, David became a fixture at the state capitol. He testified at hearings. He met with skeptical lawmakers. He brought victims to share their stories. People like Terrence, who explained how one wrongful arrest had derailed his entire life. The police union fought back hard. They claimed the reforms would make policing impossible, that officers would be afraid to do their jobs, that communities would be less safe. David responded in an interview that went viral. If your version of effective policing requires violating people's rights, then yes, that kind of policing should be impossible, he said calmly. We're not asking officers to stop doing their jobs. We're asking them to do their jobs correctly with accountability. If that's scary, maybe you're in the wrong profession. The pushback continued, but something was shifting. Officers were starting to come forward. Good officers who were tired of being lumped in with the bad ones. They wanted accountability too because they knew that every Daniels and Rodriguez out there made their jobs harder. One evening, David got a call from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Deputy Chief Thompson, this is Officer James Mitchell. You don't know me, but I've been on the force for 12 years. I wanted you to know that a lot of us support what you're doing. David was surprised. Thank you. That means a lot. It's not just me, Mitchell continued. There's a whole group of us. We're tired of good police work being overshadowed by bad officers who face no consequences. We want to help. What can we do? That call led to the formation of Officers for Accountability, a group of active police officers supporting reform. Their voices changed the conversation. When union leaders claimed officers opposed the reforms, these officers stood up and said, "Not all of us." The legislative session was coming to an end. The Police Accountability and Reform Act had been debated, amended, and debated again. David had compromised on some points, held firm on others. Now it was time for the final vote. David sat in the gallery with Lisa, holding her hand tight. His sons were there too, both dressed in suits. Michael had been following every step of the process, his anger transforming into activism. Anthony had started a youth organization at his school to educate kids about their rights. The vote was called. One by one, lawmakers voted. Yes, no, yes, yes, no. David stopped counting after a while, too nervous to keep track. Finally, the speaker announced the results. The bill passes 52 to 48. The gallery erupted in cheers. Lisa threw her arms around David, crying. Michael and Anthony hugged their father, all the tension of the past months finally releasing. But David knew this was just the beginning. The law was signed 3 weeks later. David stood behind the governor as she put pen to paper, making the Police Accountability and Reform Act official. Cameras flashed, people applauded. It felt surreal. Afterward, reporters swarmed him with questions. How does it feel to turn your negative experience into positive change? David thought carefully before answering. It doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't give me back those 4 hours in that cell, or fix the trauma my family went through. But if it prevents even one person from experiencing what I experienced, then it matters. What's next for you? The work continues, David said simply. A law is just words on paper until we implement it correctly. I'll be working with departments across the state to ensure these reforms actually happen, not just in theory but in practice. 6 months after the law passed, David was invited to speak at the Police Academy graduation. He stood before 200 new officers, young faces full of hope and determination. When I became a cop 23 years ago, I believed I was joining something noble, he began. And I still believe that. But I also learned that good intentions aren't enough. You can have all the right reasons for becoming an officer and still do tremendous harm if you're not careful, if you're not accountable, if you don't see the humanity in every person you encounter. He paused, looking out at the young officers. Some of you know my story. 6 months before the law you're now trained under was passed, I was arrested for standing on a sidewalk. 2 officers saw a black man and made assumptions. They didn't see a deputy chief. They didn't see a father, a husband, a 20-year veteran. They saw a threat that needed to be controlled. The room was silent. Here's what I need you to understand. That badge you're about to receive is powerful. It gives you authority that most people will never have. You can change lives with it for better or worse. The question is, which will you choose? He held up his own badge, the one he'd carried through everything. This badge got me out of that cell, but it shouldn't have taken a badge for me to be treated with dignity. Every person you meet deserves that dignity, whether they're a deputy chief or someone who's homeless, whether they look like you or don't, whether they're having the best day of their life or the worst. David looked at each section of the audience. You're going to make mistakes. We all do. But the difference between a mistake and misconduct is accountability. When you mess up, own it. When you see another officer mess up, speak up. Don't hide behind the blue wall. Break it down. Because that wall doesn't protect good officers, it protects bad ones at the expense of good ones. After the ceremony, several new officers approached David. They thanked him. They promised to do better. They asked for advice. One young officer, a woman named Keisha, hung back until the others left. Deputy Chief Thompson, I'm going to be the only black woman in my department. Do you have any advice for that? David smiled sadly. He knew exactly what she was facing. Remember why you're doing this, he said. Remember that you can be the change you want to see. And remember that you're not alone. Build your network. Find allies. And never, ever compromise your integrity for acceptance. Keisha nodded, determination in her eyes. As David left the academy that day, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, but something close to it. The work was far from over. There would be setbacks. There would be resistance. There would be officers who resented him and activists who thought he hadn't gone far enough. But things were changing. Slowly, painfully, but changing. That night, David sat in his backyard with Lisa, watching the sunset. His phone buzzed with a message from Terrence. He'd just gotten hired for a job he'd been rejected from twice before. His record had finally been expunged. We did something good, Lisa said softly. David nodded. We did something necessary. Michael came outside holding his laptop. Dad, you need to see this. Other states are looking at our law. 3 of them are drafting similar bills. David felt tears sting his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of something deeper. Something that felt like justice finally catching up to hope. He'd been arrested for standing on a sidewalk. It had been humiliating, infuriating, and traumatic. But he'd taken that pain and transformed it into purpose. Not just for himself, but for everyone who'd been standing on their own sidewalks waiting for someone to finally see them as human. The work would continue. But tonight, just for tonight, David allowed himself to believe that things could get better. Because sometimes they do.